keep on referring to the heat, and I think of Donald Trump, who's always telling us that America is the hottest country in the world. Well, I tell you what's hot right now. It's been our markets, our local market. The JSE has been going up and up and up. We saw that this was driven by a number of factors. We saw that the gold price rose by about 70% in 2025 and has continued to rise. PGMs, that is your platinum group metals, they've also been rising. It's been such a boon for our local markets, and it's served to reverberate right across, such that all sectors have been going up with positive sentiment. And of course, with the lower dollar, that has attracted foreign investors to come and invest on our capital markets as well. So to speak more on this and what the markets are expecting, because ultimately, yes, it is true that it's important that humans and regular people in South Africa are served, but we do need investment here, and we need a situation where people see South Africa as readily investable so that they can come and invest and hopefully create those jobs. To speak to me about this, I'm joined by Riza Ishmael. He's the head of bonds at Prescient Investment Management. Thank you so much for joining us, Ishmael. So we got very excited when S&P Global raised our credit rating, the first time in 2 decades. But we're still very much in investment junk territory, right? What is it that the finance minister will need to be saying for us to get a few notches up closer to that investment grade?
Well, I think the first thing is that the backdrop to the budget is quite constructive. I think the scaffolding is certainly in place for it to be one of the more bullish budgets that we've seen in many years, right? And I think there's a number of things that sit behind that. The first one is that we've had a very, very credible MTBPS last year. The second one is that related to that, the formal adoption of the 3% lower inflation equilibrium target. I mean, that was very, very, very market positive, and that's now been formally ratified. So that's the second positive thing.
Just break down to the South African viewer why this lowering of the inflation target is so important for them.
It's so massively important because it has ramifications for what's known as the yield curve. So this is the cost at which a country can raise funding, right? So what has been a perennial sort of underperformer in our national accounts has been this element of gross fixed capital formation. What that is, very simply, it's the propensity of private businesses to want to invest in fixed assets. Now, the reason that they haven't done so, or one of the reasons, has been because of such a high cost of capital that takes its cue from the yield curve. Now, what has now happened with the lower inflation target is that the yield curve has effectively recalibrated lower to a lower equilibrium inflation level, and that in turn means that our countrywide or our internal cost of capital is now lower, which then in theory makes it for a higher propensity to now want to basically invest in capital projects, to invest in fixed assets, and that in turn serves as a springboard for higher aggregate demand and growth going forward. So it's critically important, and I think it's one of the things that, you know, in years to come it will be written as a little bit of a masterstroke on the part of the SAB, and efficacy with which they basically communicated and then effected a lower inflation target.
So, of course, you touched on, you know, all the elements that have created a better capital market environment, if you like. We've seen the bond yields much lower, which is important. And, you know, just so that the viewer understands, is that when the bond yields are lower, it just basically means that South Africa doesn't have to pay such a high premium for money that it borrows. So the question that I want to put to you is, do you think that the minister will do enough to get our bond yields down even further?
Yeah, I think that there are some supportive factors. So one of the things that we actually even saw at the time of the MTBPS was that, you know, every week the way the National Treasury actually raises funding is via the nominal bond auctions, right? You know, the bond auctions which happen twice a week, and we saw that the size of that auction was actually cut in the previous fiscal window, right? So there is every chance that that size of that nominal auction gets reduced even further. Now, why that's important is because the general or the size of the stockpile of debt is critically important for the credibility, the overall credibility of the budget. What we don't want to see is this element of this very oft-watched metric, the debt to GDP ratio. We don't want to see that being pushed out even farther to the outer years and stabilizing at a higher peak. Now, there's no indication that that actually does happen. The indication is that it sort of holds the line. But in terms of your question of what he certainly can do, he can hold the line on expenditure priorities. And perhaps if Treasury and the Minister are smart about it, they can look at the type of funding mix that they actually use. So not just nominal bonds, but maybe explore the inflation-linked market, or maybe explore ramping up Treasury bills and shorter-dated instruments. So there are certainly some levers to pull, and I do think that there's every indication that the Minister and his team have been smart about the way that they've done it and credible about the way that they've conducted the national accounts.
Ishmael, I know one of the things, I'm almost certain, one of the things that the Finance Minister is going to raise is this issue of the primary budget surplus. National Treasury is very excited because it's managed to create these surpluses over the past couple of years, and is hoping to do so for a third consecutive one. What does that actually mean? If you create a surplus, but we still have a budget deficit, where does that surplus go? I think South Africans at home want to know, okay, fine, a surplus, that means you have more that you can set aside, but where does that go?
So specifically, a primary surplus and how it's defined is essentially looking at revenues and less expenditures, but you don't count interest service costs within that expenditure. So it's almost like saying, if I leave out debt servicing costs, do I have enough to cover standard expenditure, right? And revenues need to exceed that. The reason why a primary surplus is so imperative, and in fact we have run a small primary surplus in the past few fiscal windows, is because you don't want to have the situation of where you're relying on, in simple terms, bigger and bigger overdrafts just to keep your head above water, right? So what we want to see is, so the direction of travel has clearly been in the right way, but what we want to see is an increasing primary surplus, and we want to also see gradually the proportion of revenue that is consumed by debt servicing costs. We want to see that gradually and incrementally come down, right? It's quite high. It's about a fifth of revenue at the moment, and we want to see that fraction getting ever lower. So I think we are on a healthy footing, but there is no sort of consolidated surplus. There's no extra money, as it were, because you need to definitely factor in debt servicing costs. But excluding that, that's where the notion of primary surplus comes about.
All right, super. Thank you so much, Riza, for your time and your insights. That was Riza Ishmael. He's the head of bonds at Prescient Investment Management, just giving us a sense of his expectations. He seems to be positive. He's talking about how the macroeconomic environment is positive for the finance minister, the National Treasury, but it's about how are they going to use the leverage that's created from this current situation. With that, let's take it back to studio.
All right, Nompumelelo Siziba leading our team in Cape Town as we continue our build up to 2 o'clock. For now, Nompu, thanks very much indeed.